Hey everyone, I hope that you're doing well. In this video, I just want to talk a little bit about the Porfiriato in the context of the conversations we had on Twitter and on the discussion board. I think we're off to a strong start, and I just want to commend you for all of your work and your exchanges with one another, thinking more deeply about the significance of the Porfiriato and how and why it created the terms for a revolution in 1910. All of that said, I want to start with the first line from chapter 2 of Gonzalez. The first sentence is, "No one saw the revolution coming." So he writes that after describing the whole Porfiriato, talking about the modernization programs, talking about all of the various industries, including railroads, mining, petroleum. Also, he talked about el buen tono, the cigarette industry, and the clothing industries that actually made a lot of money. I said were profitable, whereas other types of industry weren't necessarily during the Porfirian regime. So he lays out the ways in which modernization came, enriched the wealthy. The científicos were on the side of notions of positivism, which have been equated with, or at least grouped together with, notions of scientific racism out of Europe, the close of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Again, that was going back to notions that came out of the US and out of European countries about how certain racial groups were superior to others. Others were backwards because of intermixing, and lack of purity, because of where they had come from, because of their heritage, whether or not they had mixed with other groups of people. People of African descent were considered very low on the chain, or on the spectrum, I should say, as were native peoples, indigenous peoples. And so, again, these were attitudes that a lot of the people coming into Mexico, a lot of the investors had about the people, about what their capacity was, about what they were sort of destined to do and be. And that played a role in, the way things turned out. So Gonzalez and also Castro, talk about the kind of dark side of this modernization. Talked about the growing corruption, growing authoritarianism under Porfirio Diaz that eventually alienated everyone, not just lower classes, but also those who were looking for some sort of political opening. So these were middle class, educated people who went to universities such as the Flores Magón brothers, who recognized that within the system that Porfirio Diaz had created, a very centralized system, there was no place for them. There was no place for them to gain a foothold or to participate in the sorts of kind of leading ways that they would have wanted to, in a sort of democratic way. And so, again, after explaining all of this history, Gonzalez says nobody saw the revolution coming. And even Diaz, with the 1908 Creelman interview, makes us think he didn't see the revolution coming. But then again, there was this figure, Francisco Madero, who we'll talk a lot more about, who was seemingly something of a figurehead once events kind of got into motion in November of 1910. But as we'll see, I think was much more than that. So I don't want to move on to that point. But instead, I wanted to point out a couple things in the Porfirio Diaz chapter in Gonzalez to think about. And these were nudges I was trying to give you on Twitter, and here now that I've read some of the discussions, thinking about liberalism in Mexico and what that meant. So 19th century liberalism, such as that espoused by Benito Juárez and Lerdo de Tejada, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, these were notions of creating free markets, of ending the monopoly that institutions like the church had on land and wealth, that also ended up translating into breaking up communal holdings of indigenous people, because they were lumped together into that way of holding land that didn't fit a more capitalist kind of privatized model. And so it was a transition in that direction that we see as kind of the root of some of these issues. At least that's the way they're described in the context of Diaz. But Juarez and Lerdo de Tejado, they started those things in motion. For them, liberalism was about getting all of these individual liberties and things that were the very positive things that we think about with that type of 19th century liberalism. And again, this does not mean the same thing that it means in our current U.S. political context, right? But, within that rubric, we think of, and Benito Juarez is often revered in Mexican history as a heroic figure, but he centralized things just as much as Diaz did. Diaz took a kind of page from his book in centralizing power. He may have been more effective and efficient at it than Juarez, although can't be too sure, because Juarez's tenure in Mexico was cut short when he had a heart attack in 1871. But even he was running for re-election when supposedly anti-re-election, or not running consecutive terms over and over again, was one of these tenets of liberalism. And I just point this out to kind of push us to think about or interrogate, I guess, our notions of where the positive and negative kind of came about in 19th century Mexican history. And I do appreciate the long history that Gonzalez gives us here. I'll stop rambling on about that. Hopefully that proves some sort of insight or help to kind of close up the conversations we were having about Diaz. We'll come back to those, of course. Also, if you've stayed with me this far, I appreciate it. One last comment is that I know there are several questions that some of you posed that I didn't answer, whether on Twitter or as I'm kind of wrapping up the discussion board with this Medium post and video. And I'm not doing that, or I guess I'm doing that intentionally. I'm not just kind of forgetting or glossing over what you said. But questions about Cardenas, for example, we're definitely going to get into that in a lot more detail. And so I wanted to wait until we've done the readings and we have some more ideas to sort of support a better conversation about those issues. We did get a whole overview of the revolution with Wasserman's introduction and a couple of the other pieces we read for Unit 1. So we already have those things on the horizon, where the revolution went, what it means or what it's said to have meant. We'll come back to all of that in just a couple of weeks. So wanted to let you know that. I hope you're having a good day, and I will talk to you soon.